Hi, welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy. I'm here with Mark. How are you?
Good. We've lost. Daniel's lost his mind a little bit.
Yeah. This is probably like the fifth start of this
The fifth
episode.
start. We tried to start this 5 times and it was continually stopped, not by pastries, but by Daniel asking the question. It began with the question Daniel asked if Stalin had a dog, which then was several minutes of deep dive Googling where we discovered Stalin did have a dog.
And it was apparently nicknamed Stalin's dog.
Stalin's dog.
Which I maintain is not a nickname. It's just what it is.
It was a black Russian terrier.
The communist state at the time did not permit creativity around nicknames. It was very
Stalin's dog, Stalin's chair, Stalin's table.
Could be a good podcast title.
Stalin's dog.
Maybe not.
Okay, well, we'll get back to you guys about the Stalin's Dog podcast. But in the meantime, we're going to continue with some listener questions. And I'm just going to get right into it. The first one is from Daniel, and not the one sitting here with me. It's Daniel Attaway. What would you add to Mike Kosper's analysis of the rise and fall of Mars Hill in regards to American megachurch ecclesiology?
Well, I would not add anything because I've not listened to it.
Okay, fair enough.
So it's a podcast for those of you who don't.
Yeah, released by
give us the lowdown, Daniel.
Christianity Today, is that right?
Christianity Today on, I think it's a bit of a deep dive into Mars Hill Church in Seattle. And what went on there with
Mark Driscoll.
Mark Driscoll.
Yeah.
And
I've been thinking about having a listen. So
Well, I've not been able to listen because I'm subjected to deep dives into Stalin's dog. Have not listened, currently writing a book. And my research information muscles are being used on other things. Like yesterday, I'm writing about spiritual strongholds, and yesterday I was researching how castles emerged in the wake of the Roman Empire disappearing, where the prohibition on building private fortifications was laxed, and individuals, as the state collapsed or the empire collapsed, started building their own fortresses. So I was deep into that. So
that sounds really fascinating.
It actually is fascinating.
Can we do a whole episode on that? Oh no, how about you just write a book?
I'll write a book on it.
Yeah, right.
But it is interesting that segue. Okay, we've gone from Mars Hill. I'm going to segue into this because it is a slight interesting tangent. But
into castles.
Well, it's interesting because castles are actually castles.
Castles for all the UK listeners.
Slash South
Australians.
South Australians, yes. For those who are not Australians, Liddy and I are Victorians.
Yes.
From the state of Victoria. Daniel is from the state of South Australia. We say castle and Daniel says
Castle.
However, I will refer to Newcastle as Newcastle because that's what the locals call it, whereas Castlemaine in Victoria is Castlemaine.
Yeah, wow.
Castlemaine.
Well, back to castles.
Yes.
So it's really interesting too because we've talked a lot here about decentralization, and what I learned was that castles were a result of decentralization. When the Roman Empire began to move away from a centralized system under a giant sort of rule of the Caesar, and that split, and there was a split into the different Caesars vying for power. Then you had the Dark Ages came after that, and in a sense that big overarching centralized power disappeared, and Europe went much more into a networked sort of configuration. And what that meant was that all of a sudden you went from one giant empire into this patchwork. So you think of the medieval period, it's this patchwork of castles. So really, castles were like. They're like these little empires in miniature. And it's interesting too, because just to bring this back to culture,
Sure.
It's interesting too that I wonder this is what I'm sort of currently writing, is that as the sort of centralized vision of the American century and sort of globalization begins to move into a more decentralized sense, before we lived under the protection of all, particularly people living in that American century lived under the protection of that big thing, but now as it's sort of decentralizing will be one of the trends of the future, that people sort of create their own personal castles. I don't mean literally, but I mean more sort of, emotionally, psychically, where, you have to put up your protective walls. Because it's really interesting, like biblically, a stronghold is a fascinating image of something that we we enter into strongholds to protect ourselves from anxiety.
Yeah, okay.
So if you think about like nomads in order to plant seeds in the ground and grow those seeds had to stick around. So nomads became farmers because you have to stick around for the seasonal cycle of seeds to grow up from the ground. You all of a sudden then you don't have the advantage of a nomad who moves around the countryside, and people would then build fortifications to protect themselves. So that's sort of what the original stronghold. So in the sort of biblical language, you have this idea of a stronghold where people go to find refuge from anxiety. But then you see like David and in the Psalms, they talk about God is our stronghold.
Yes.
So our stronghold is in the protection of God, not in the sort of fortifications and constructions of humanity. So that means that as we move from sort of in some ways you can think about like the American century as a giant stronghold, or the globalized world as a giant stronghold. And we're now moving into this more disrupted age where basically people will construct their own personal strongholds, almost like a sort of protective individualism. But then also there's an opportunity where at moments when the foundations of the big strongholds are rocked, that's actually when people have the opportunity to turn to God for God to be their stronghold. And there's that image when the rebellion against David, and David sort of goes almost back into the wilderness. He's like leaving Jerusalem as this sort of stronghold and returning into the wilderness. None of that has anything to do with Mars Hill, but I enjoyed that tangent.
Yeah, that's great. Nice little insight into what's to come in your book. Our next question's from Rachel, and I'm going to read it verbatim for you. And then we'll dig into answering. So, hey, we have a small church here in a big city, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I think COVID accelerated changes to where our church was already hoping to go, toward more missional micro churches, outward community focused, etc., rather than simply Sunday morning, week after week. Anyway, I feel the pushback to it is more around people thinking we've allowed COVID to influence too greatly how the church body meets. How do leaders encourage changes like this in this transitional time and have the congregation see it as God-driven, not fear or pandemic or cultural-driven? Many churches, I'm sure, are making big changes to how and where they meet, but likely it's not all because of COVID. COVID just sort of pushed them quicker down that road.
Yeah. Really good question. Okay, so if you think about how churches operate, you can almost think about it in three ways. One is like, what have we always done? Let's call it the power of the status quo. And sometimes that can be good in the sense of tradition can get you through certain seasons, and there's a reason we repeat some of these patterns and so on. But really, that's the force, which is like, well, you've got to have church, you've got to have a Sunday, you've got to have a bunch of bodies in the room. And in some ways, that struggles with, what happens when there's a disruption like COVID. And then what you've got is you've got a vision or ecclesiology of, okay, well, how do we do church? How do we do church in this place? And what's the most effective form that's going to enable us to be disciples of Jesus? What's the most effective form that's going to enable us to be the kingdom of God in our community, share the good news of Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. You then have cultural forces. And cultural forces push us in particular ways. You see some churches whose ecclesiology is deeply shaped by the culture. To perhaps point the finger, you look at something like prosperity theology, you say that's where the ecclesiology is heavily influenced by the culture, and I would say probably in quite unhelpful ways. So I think, then you've got something different, which we haven't really thought about, and I would say it's the environment which we're operating in. So we've thought about tradition, we've thought about how do we do a more effective ecclesiology, we've thought about the push of the culture. What's happened with COVID is we've had this fourth one. It's not really about culture because it's actually something that's happened in the environment, where the environment has changed. It might be similar to, say, what's happened in the growth of the gospel amongst Persian people. Their environment changed when many people had to leave Iran or Afghanistan, where Persian people leave and go across the world. That's changed the face of the church, or the fact that the environment, you have to meet in different ways. Okay, so I think there's that when COVID came along, a lot of people who wanted a different ecclesiology to perhaps what their church was doing, that might be just ordinary people in the back pew who wanted to do church differently, or leaders who wanted to move their church in a different direction, saw COVID as an opportunity to then so it's no use wasting a crisis to then use that to affect change.
Yes.
One problem with that is this. COVID is a continually changing, complex environment. So, for example, when COVID happened first here in Melbourne, I had lots of people and friends, and not just Melbourne, but around the world, who were like, okay, well, this is going to be the moment of the small micro house church.
Yeah.
And even, we set people up for that. So even the first couple of weeks, we went online, but then we encouraged people to meet in houses. We had groups of 10, 20. But then the lockdown orders came for houses,
Yeah.
So what this sort of situation changing, we talked about this last episode, Delta is changing the rules of the game again. And we find ourselves in this really interesting place in Melbourne where I can't visit your guys' houses.
No.
So you can't go into someone else's house physically, but our lockdown rules say that we can still have church capped at 100 with masks, social distancing, and QR codes. So it's this really interesting thing is that possibly with COVID and possibly in a disrupted world, the actual possibilities are less set by your ecclesiology as they are set by the changing environment. Now, we're not used to that. We're used to let's, have our ecclesiology. Our ecclesiology is the meat and the sandwich between tradition and where the culture's going, and we try and create this balance.
Yes.
But now there's new element of the environment. So I think that, the essence of this question behind it, so what's the heart here? The heart behind doing micro churches, reaching out into the community more, I think it's fantastic. It's how do we genuinely live biblical Christian community? How do we genuinely share the good news with our friends and neighbors? How do we be the hands and feet of Jesus in the community? And how do we have a genuine discipleship process that we can go through? I think rightly many people are seeing the sort of program-driven church has not been delivering that in the way that we thought. The sort of event Sunday type thing has not really delivered that. If we look at the last 30 years, the church has continued to decline. We're facing a discipleship crisis at this moment. So I think there's a rightful, questioning of that. But what we've got to be careful as well is that I think the solution is not always going to be in the forms. So, for example, we can't do house churches at this point in time in Melbourne. So we have to adapt. So I would say for people, what are the key defining first principles that you're trying to instigate in your church? Discipleship, kingdom, moving towards renewal, moving towards revival, growing people in Jesus, evangelism, whatever that may be, and then being more adaptable that all the other ways that we do it, there's a lot of latitude to move in those spaces. I think that's the adaptive approach that we need to take in the sort of next season as the environment is continually changing.
Yeah, great answer. I wonder as well if it's there's also an opportunity to look back to some of the stuff that Terry Walling took us through last season in our response to change.
Yes.
Not just our response as leaders, but also our congregations responding to transitions, some of them not willing to admit that the change is occurring or that, they're just over everything being so messy all the time and just gone into this whole space of denial. So, yeah, I'd encourage you to go back and have a listen to that Terry Walling stuff as well, because I think that's particularly pertinent for what is happening in your congregation too. Shall I head us to the final question for this episode?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. So this one's from Mike, and he said, I'm always interested in your take on, in talking marks, if I was planting a church today, what would the model / location / key missional goals / name / style / pastries, etc. be?
I would cut out everything but pastries. Begin with your pastries. Great. Yeah. Early on in planting, you don't have as much resources. 7-Eleven is a good start, and then just have a 5-year plan to build up to the the best pastries you've ever had. A good question. I think my thinking has significantly changed in the last few years around this. In probably, this was 5-10 years ago, I've been a lot more enamored around model. I would have been a lot more enamored around, even setting particular missional goals, calling it, what you would call it, is it some super hip name or, just call it some traditional name people can relate to. I would not plant a church now without first building a remnant. And, what you will often see in a church plant is this thing where you're starting off, you're fragile, and so often you'll bring people into the circle who, may not have the same hunger for God, or they may be wanting a different kind of church. They may be, I don't want to be a part of this big mega church I was part of. Now I want to be part of this small thing. We put our biases over something, and often, there's this thing. And often what you'll see this dynamic. I've seen it so often with church plants where someone will plant, they get a team, and the team gathers and it's all great and they sent off and, you've got it might be 10, might be 20, might be 30, whatever, might be 100. And then they plant. But then almost in the next phase to get to the next level of growth, they've almost got to break through the expectations of that first group of sort of pioneers who actually you think because you want to grow, there's this anxiety in you to I need people because I'm going to be embarrassed if on that first launch Sunday or however you're planting that, it's just going to be me standing there embarrassed. And so, you often bring people into the fold who don't have the same heart. I think that the engine of any plant, I think any church, is a church alive with God's presence. And I would actually plant it now, build it around that. And build a remnant. So I think a lot of the principle was spoken about, building a remnant, people contending, bring it around worship of God, bring it around hunger for Him, bring that around His Word, people who are genuinely committed to a discipleship journey. They would trump any sort of what are we going to call it? What's its style going to be? Red has changed styles multiple times. Red has changed models multiple times. But what has continued to enable us to do that is an increasing push into, a heart for God. So I think that's got to be the absolute, pole that keeps the entire sort of tent up. That I would focus on creating, I go back to Steve Addison's quote at the beginning of his book on movements, all movements begin with white hot faith. So I would focus first on building a group of people with white hot faith. Yes, you do need to plan about the rest of the stuff, but you get the steam engine at the front of your train, not the dining car. Great.
I'm just going to throw in this last question because I feel like it comes off the back of what you were just saying. Michael has asked if the leaders of a church were serious about seeking renewal, what would you suggest they do?
That definitely does bounce off it. Again, too, I think what you can't do is run a PR campaign or a communications campaign or even a program which brings about renewal. What you can do is see where God is at work, whose hearts are being drawn to Him, and find the remnant of people within your church who are going to be forerunners and they're going to be a model of what is to come. I would say don't do that as part of the main functioning of your church necessarily. So, for example, it's not like, okay, we're now changing our Sunday morning service to the revival renewal service. What I would do is I'd start something adjacent, on Thursday night after the service. Whoever wants to pray, get up at 6:00, praise through the night, get people praying, get people studying the great revival histories. Go onto YouTube and find, was it Edwin Orr or whatever, talk about the history of revivals, just people listen to that. Throw some books around. Throw seeds out of renewal and revival and see where those seeds land. And then as you see those seeds land, and obviously also go back to the classic, personal renewal leads to corporate change. The revival's got to begin in you. But once that's begun, I would then form a space within your church where the remnant can gather and talk about what their heart's about, and make that space the safe space for those people to talk about renewal and then allow that to grow and almost allow it to have a magnetic approach. We've talked about before that, Napoleon's thirds, where you've got the first third of a worm, or, the other way to think about it's a worm. The worm is pulled forward by the front, the middle comes, and the last bit's dragged. So what you want to do is you want to create a remnant You want to inspire them. You want to pour your time into them. You want to invest in those people, and together seeking God, contending for God. And then, in a sense, what that remnant will, and this could take time, like patience. It could take 2 months, it could take 4 years. They, in a sense, become that front of the worm, pulling the rest of the church forward. Will there be backlash and pushback? In every revival there is. There is no way to do a church growth renewal revival program without some people pushing back. And someone said to me once, sometimes the people who are complaining that things are changing are often the ones not growing. So that will happen. This church has changed. Oh, it's different. It's not like it used to be. That dynamic will always be there. But the heart hungry after God finds others whose hearts are hungry after God, create a space for that to happen, and then allow that just to grow. I think is one of the best things that we can do to start to move into that posture and ask God to sovereignly move amongst us.
Great. I think that's a really great space to leave this round of listener questions. We'll be back soon with some more listener questions. See you next time.